everyone, and welcome back to another book review. First of all, if you're new here, I post new book reviews on both fiction and non-fiction books almost every single day, so if you're looking for some reading inspiration or if you like following book reviews, then feel free to stick around. Today I'm going to be reviewing a book from my latest fall library haul, so if you haven't seen my fall library haul, go check it out and feel free to recommend things you think I should also be reading this fall. But today we are going to be reviewing Wicked Women of Detroit by Tobin T. Buhk. So I checked this out of the library because the title of this captured my attention, Wicked Women. I thought, what is the characteristic of a wicked woman? I didn't know if this was going to be people who maybe today we would still perceive as being wicked, although I do think that term is it comes across as very harsh and maybe a little outdated. Is it serial killers, murderers, people who did really horrible, atrocious things? Or I'm also thinking, because this appears to be a history book, that maybe they're using the word wicked to describe women who are perceived as wicked in their day. So people who, I don't know, were drunk in public or something along those lines. So I was really interested in how the author was going to address this rather sensationalized headline. At least in my opinion, it was a sensationalized headline. So I checked it out because I wanted to see it. Also, it was kind of short. I did have some concerns, a little concern up front with regard to the true crime aspect. I am not a true crime girl. I do not enjoy true crime. I do have to stop and put a little caveat here. When I say true crime, I'm mostly referring to murder, and that seems to be what a lot of the true crime genre seems to be focused on. I get very scared easily, and I can't consume that sort of stuff easily or frequently without becoming really scared and unnerved myself. It's just who I am. I also am very, very sensitive with regard to violence or depictions of violence, especially when it's in real life, but even fiction, I can barely do it. So true crime as a genre is really not for me. I have read true crime in the past, and I will read it if there's something else besides the true crime element that I think I'm going to get out of it. For example, I read one true crime which was, the title of the book was Forever Witness, which talked about how there was this new field of DNA genealogy that they can use to start cracking these cold cases from the 70s and 80s. I felt like that book was appropriate for me because there was a focus on something besides the true crime. So this one I thought was going to be an interesting it's upside down, an interesting look at like this localized history in Detroit, and I really enjoy reading history books that tend to be focused on more local events. I just find that history is pretty interesting to me. So I was a little worried about the true crime aspect. I also want to note that I had read something by this author before, Tobin T. Buhk. So he's written some historical works before. He seems to write a lot about local history in the state of Michigan. So that's just what he tends to write. The book I read before was called Cold Case Michigan, a true crime book, but it was not chosen by my own volition. Cold Case Michigan was chosen because it was the book that was chosen for the book club that I'm a part of, so I did not read that on my own volition, but the book review is on my channel. So wicked, that was really the point, or the word in the title that drew me in, was the word wicked. I wanted to know how the author was going to address this kind of sensationalized headline, and fortunately the author addresses it right away. He says, look, I'm using the word wicked because this is how these women were perceived in their time, whether or not that characterization is accurate. He talks about many inequalities that existed in society. For example, a man could become very, very intoxicated and even become violent in public and not really receive much more than a reprimand. But a woman just being drunk in public, even if she wasn't bothering anyone, was enough to sentence her to some time in the local jail. So he talks about how there's this higher moral requirement, I guess you could say, on women back then. And so there was a characterization of women who were wicked, who really by today's standards weren't truly wicked. The author talks about also how he selected the women to show in his book. He didn't want to pick anyone who was doing some sort of murder in self-defense. He didn't want to pick anyone who there was really a defensible reason for their crimes, for like self-defense, for example, or perhaps an abusive spouse. So he tried to pick people who maybe even by today's standards were up to some shady stuff. I also really appreciated throughout this book that the author did not just pick women who committed murder. He picked a wide variety of crimes. And going back to the caveat I said about true crime, I do kind of find heists interesting. If no one lost their life and just a whole bank vault got robbed, people lost money, it is a crime, it needs to be looked into. I don't think you should be able to get away with it just because it's a cool crime. But because there's not a loss of life or an injury, I do think it's kind of interesting to read about how these things could be pulled off. So I was very intrigued and pleased that the author Tobin T. Buhk included crimes in here that weren't just murder. Although there was quite a bit of murder in this book, it wasn't just focused on that. Something that the author really focused on as he selected these cases, and the way the book is set up is he introduces a case and describes it. I will say that the writing in this book is kind of sensationalized, and I've read better true crime books, I will say that, but I think the author does a really good job of trying to get the story going and flowing the best he can. I feel like this book is not just a dry rendition of the facts. He tries to add some color and some characterization without straying too far from the facts, which I know some people appreciate. My sister, I believe, likes these kind of books. I recommended this one to her, and some people like that color and characterization, so they're not just reading excerpts from a newspaper from the 1920s. I would kind of prefer just like the excerpts from the newspapers from the 1920s without all the color or characterization, but I can do with that stuff included in the book. So in all these cases, the author kind of is pointing out places where women's inequality still existed. So at the time that these crimes took place, and I should add this is a historical book, so things that happened late 1800s, early 1900s, women didn't have full equality in society, particularly with like women's suffrage, which didn't come about in the United States until later in history. Women have not always had the right to vote, and women have not always had the right to do things like sit on a jury. So when a woman went to trial, she was not going to be sitting truly in front of a jury of her peers. She was going to be sitting in front of a jury of men. However, women kind of used this inequality and they weaponized it in the way that they could get things to their advantage, even though things were unequal overall in society. For example, women going in front of an all-male jury sometimes fared better because they could just cry. In certain instances that were mentioned in this book, women would rent babies that weren't theirs to bring to court to be like, my poor baby is going to be motherless. And a male jury would acquit this woman who there was overwhelming evidence that they had committed the crime. So women would try to weaponize the inequality of society to their own advantage, particularly these like con women or women who are running scams. And I thought that was really interesting, and I enjoyed reading about how women worked with their inequalities in society and kind of turned them to their advantage when they were in situations like court, having to answer to some of their crimes that they had committed. The crimes in this book that were most interesting to me, fittingly, were the ones that were like scams, the ones where women pretended to be someone they were not, or they were trying to blackmail people into giving them money. I thought those were more interesting. I feel like they require a little bit more brain. I feel like, first of all, I just kind of have a distaste about reading too much about murders. Nothing is graphic in this book at all. Nothing's graphically or sensationally described, but I like the ones that are more scams because they kind of show the women's inner thought pattern, or you can kind of see how clever some of these women were when they were trying to pull off these scams, or when they successfully pulled off these scams. And I also enjoyed reading from a historical context on some of the ways it was easier than today. Of course, nowadays we have the internet, which opens a whole new world of scamming opportunities, but in the 1920s, you could just take a train to a different city and no one could really verify your identity, who your spouse was, if what you were saying was true, and that led to a lot of opportunity for people who might be a little more criminally inclined. So I thought reading about how women did that was super interesting, and I enjoyed reading about all these women who were doing unsavory things that they needed to answer for, but reading about how they did it was kind of interesting, and learning about the historical context in which they accomplished these things was also interesting. Overall, this book is just kind of a collection of historical tidbits from an area. I enjoyed it. I thought overall it was well done. Again, I could use without like the colorization. I don't know how to describe it. Like the filling in the blanks to make more of a narrative versus a bland rendition of facts, which is Tobin's style, that narrative style. I could do without the narrative and go more just for the facts, but that's personal preference. If you prefer the narrative style, you'll probably like the writing a little bit more than I did, but I thought the book overall was really well done. I would probably give this 4 out of 5 stars, which is higher than I expected to give it. I expected maybe a 3 out of 5 star read, but a 4 out of 5 star read, very interesting. I read it almost in one sitting. Started a little bit of it, and then I finished it all in one sitting, sitting in bed one night. So much better, and better than I expected, which is always a good thing. And if this sounds interesting to you, then maybe check it out. Now, there's one thing I wanted to point out before I end, and that is, maybe this sounded interesting, but you're not very familiar with Detroit, or you don't live in this part of the United States, or you're wondering if maybe you could read something more local to you. Fortunately, the answer is yes. So I pulled up some more books that were in this series just on my library app. We have Wicked Women of Detroit, Wicked Women of Ohio, Missouri, New Mexico. We have, let's see, Seattle, Washington. We have Greensboro, Richmond, Sacramento, Bozeman, Montana, Prescott, Joplin, Decatur, Boise, Beaufort, Greenville, Adirondacks, Kansas, Indianapolis. The list goes on. Basically, if you live somewhere else in the United States and you want to see if there's a Wicked Women variety or a book that talks about wicked women, but for the region that you live in, maybe check out your local library, the library apps, or the History Press, which is the publisher of this that I'll have linked in the description, to see if they offer a book on the local history to your area. I know that sometimes reading things that maybe are closer to home could be a little bit more interesting. Maybe if you're in the Seattle area, you don't really care about this, but I'm not from the Seattle area and I would love to read a book on wicked women in Seattle. So some people don't really particularly care if it's not super local to them and they're happy to read it, in which case maybe give this one a try. If you've read this book, have any thoughts on this book, have any suggestions for books I should read next, then feel free to put it in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching and I hope you have a great rest of your day.